Welcome to Stephen Foster at 200. I'm your co-host, Jason Lee Guthrie. On today's episode, I talk with Samantha Ege about the connection between Stephen Foster and William Grant Still. Samantha is a pianist, musicologist, and a senior research fellow and lecturer at the University of Southhampton. She is a leading scholar of African-American composer Florence B. Focusing on the Black Chicago Renaissance and Black women's advocacy networks. She has a celebrated performance career and has received multiple prestigious awards and fellowships for her contributions to musicology. Our conversation covered the complex legacy of Stephen Foster's songs in African-American musical performance. You have done some research into an American musical figure named William Grant Still. Tell us a little bit about who he was. Tell us a little bit about his life, and then we'll kind of dive into some of the places where his musical career intersects with Stephen Foster.
William Grant Still was born in the late 19th century. He grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and he was childhood friends with Florence Price. He had such a strong inclination towards music from such a young age. He was certainly encouraged to take a more lucrative path as a doctor. His parents, his mother in particular, was certainly concerned that to be a musician was to encounter a life of financial precarity. But he was very much determined that he would be a musician, be a composer. And so that's what he did. And he really blazed a trail in this very white, very restrictive environment, speaking about classical music. It was definitely expected that musicians of African descent would pursue popular music, jazz, blues. And William Grant Still was very familiar with these styles, but at the same time, it was classical music that had really inspired him, and that's what he wanted to pursue. And so while today we might know of Florence Price as one of the trailblazing Black symphonic composers of the 1930s, William Grant Still was actually a real pioneer in terms of writing his Afro-American symphony. He was known as the Dean of Afro-American Composers. And he really did speak up against the racism of the classical music industry, which led to him being blacklisted. And so in this current climate where we're seeing composers of African descent be revived within the mainstream, there is a notable quietness around William Grant Still. And part of that is to do with the way that he was frozen out of the industry in his time.
A lot of musicians today could relate to what you were saying about the advice he received from his mother. Many of those narratives still surround the music industry today, that you might want to choose a more stable career. Still was inspired by classical music, but also by American popular music styles. Tell us a little bit about how Still's musical career intersects with the work of Stephen Foster.
I guess with Stephen Foster's output, I think what was really interesting about having the opportunity to write this was to think about Still's relationship to Foster's music and to the music that Foster himself was drawing upon, which sort of has this full circle effect in terms of William Grant Still's ancestry. All popular music in the United States is built upon the music of the enslaved, the music of the spirituals and plantation dances and various folk forms, art forms that came out of the enslavement era. And so William Grant Still was very much aware of the fact that white creatives could capitalize on this, and the music would be understood as belonging to these white cultural creators just because of how separate the worlds were in terms of Black artistry not being recognized, but also not being registered in the same way in the legal sense around copyright and ownership, and also the importance of physical publications, which meant that you could have a folk song, and if a white publisher published it, it fell under the name of that publisher. So William Grant Still was very much aware of these various hypocrisies and tensions. But at the same time, these minstrel songs and these forms of popular music that did appropriate were also popular within Black communities too. Stephen Foster was not a name that could be avoided. So I think that there's something really interesting about the way William Grant Still chooses to engage and is quite, I think, specific about that approach.
Is it fair to characterize the way that Still reimagines Foster's music as in line with other ways that Black Americans, and as well as other minority Americans, when cultural appropriation happens, they find ways to turn it inside out or use it for their own purposes?
Absolutely. And again, that's something I really wanted to explore in this chapter, this concept of signifying, which I think we see a lot, not just applied to music, but all forms of artistic expression where the concept is repetition with a difference. We see it in the way that Black composers draw upon European traditions and rewrite them in a language that is authentic to them, in a way that can meld pastiche, it can meld parody, it can be an earnest tribute. The key is that the language is being redirected in a way that's empowering. And I think that's what Still was engaging with in terms of approaching Foster's music. I talk about this sort of double-voicedness where there are almost two conversations happening. There's the conversation with Foster, but there's also that deeper conversation with Black antebellum folk music and dance. When you look at Still's wider body of work, where he is very much drawing on the African continent, the African diaspora, that doesn't get forgotten just because he's engaging with Foster's work.
One of the authors that you cite in your chapter is Matthew Morrison's Black Sound, who also writes the conclusion for our volume, who is also interested in intellectual property and history of copyright. You mentioned Still and these issues of copyright. What can you tell us about Still's own sort of understanding and use of copyright? Was he barred from full participation in that very material way, in the same way that he was barred from full participation by being blacklisted?
Because he was a composer of written music, of notated music, there's a certain sort of autonomy that he has. So even being blacklisted, no one could take his name away from anything that he wrote because it was a written music. And I think that's a really important part of the continuum within Black music, moving from, not to say that it's linear or hierarchical in any way, but the fact that Still was working in a written genre made his work in some ways more legible, but also gave him ownership over that work just because of the system of copyright and music publication, etc. And for that reason, I also think that there is something really powerful in what he's doing with engaging with Foster, because he's giving voice to not the voiceless, but those whose voices couldn't be carried in the same way or be carried through the same media. I think that is something that is very important to not just Still, but that whole sort of era of New Negro or Black Renaissance composers. And that's a wider context in which I'm framing Still's activity here in a modernism that is not European or Eurocentric. It's a very Afrocentric modernism that he's engaging with that has all of these ideas about autonomy and rebirth.
In some ways, your chapter in the volume is the next step in what Matthew Morrison covers in the book Black Sound. His book goes from the early 19th century to the early 20th century, and you kind of pick up after there. It's interesting the emphasis on composition, because one of the terms that Morrison uses is intellectual performance property, to try to come up with some way to communicate the value of a largely live, largely spontaneous, and largely non-commodifiable influence that characterizes so much of the contribution of Black Americans to American popular music. I wanted to end by asking specifically about William Grant Still's version of Swanee River and why you felt that song in particular was the best fit to be the central focus of your chapter.
I remember seeing that William Grant Still had written this work, Swanee River, and actually I didn't know too much about the context behind it. And then my former PhD advisor, William Brooks, got in touch to say, there's this volume that's happening. What do you think about making a contribution? And things began to click for me. I thought, hold on, I've seen William Grant Still and Swanee River. I don't know what the story is, but that could be something that I write about. And also because I am a Florence Prize scholar and I write so much about Black women in music, I thought this would just be a really great way to stretch myself intellectually and try something slightly different. And so it was just really that curiosity of what's the story here? And that's actually quite an exciting place to start because you don't know what the story is until you do it. So to see that there was a piano collection of 29, you could call them variations almost on the theme of Swanee River, was really fascinating to me. And being a pianist as well, I have a strong piano bias in the music that I gravitate towards. So that was really fascinating to think about. How are these different composers approaching this at an instrument that I feel is very much my instrument? Playing Still's interpretation, I'm very attentive to how it feels, not just how it sounds, but how it feels under the fingers, how it feels in the body. And there's just something very, I don't know, maybe sacred is too strong a word, but it struck me how choral the music felt. It felt like it belonged in the voice, but I could hear its connections to the concert spiritual and these other genres that I'd explored. That's really how I came to the piece, just from this perspective of being curious. And also, I guess I wanted to be, with William Grant Still's story, I think there's a lot of sensitivity in terms of the William Grant Still estate. There is a biography on Still that the estate is not happy with. And so I also just wanted to be really careful about the narrative and just to honor the estate and to tread carefully there. I didn't want my work to go down a slightly more challenging route there. So I really just wanted to focus on his interactions with this work and what it is that he's trying to say. And then being a pianist myself, who's very familiar with his wider piano repertoire, I was able to bring in comparisons and see what is he doing. And I think that sort of contributes a slightly different perspective to the volume, just because I'm coming at it from a different angle with a different composer. And I personally just really enjoyed getting to know this side of Still's output and to have that work intersect with the wider legacy of Stephen Foster. So I really hope that readers will enjoy learning about this and hopefully even playing the music.
It's a really excellent chapter with the historical storytelling and the cultural criticism and the musicology. It's a very rich piece. So thank you so much for contributing and for sharing with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Stephen Foster at 200 is a companion podcast to the edited volume Stephen Foster at 200, A Critical Reappraisal. If you enjoyed this episode, check out the book for in-depth, peer-reviewed research authored by our guests. You can also check out our website, stephenfosterat200.com, for more information about the book and links to more research from our guests. This podcast is hosted by Jenny Lightwise Goff and me, Jason Lee Guthrie. I am also the executive producer. Our intro theme is by Joel Corey. O Oksana, the Russian language cover of O Susanna you're hearing now, is by Dan Vexler. Logo design by Alan Z. Support for this podcast comes from a generous grant from the Music and Entertainment Industry Educators Association. The best way for you to support the show is by leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts and sharing the show on social media.